do you think about China? We've seen President Trump call President Xi both an enemy and a friend.
Well, the president clearly has no strategy. You know, when I first got into this race, I remember President Trump scoffed and said he'd like to see me making a deal with Xi Jinping. I'd like to see him making a deal with Xi Jinping. Is it just me, or was that supposed to happen in, like, April? It's one more example of a commitment not made. When that happens on the international stage, people take note. Not just our competitors, our adversaries, but also our allies take note of the inability of the United States to keep its word or follow through on its plans.
What he has done here, he has assessed these tariffs on our allies. He has put us in the middle of this trade war, and he is treating our farmers and our workers like poker chips in one of his bankrupt casinos. And if we are not careful, he is going to bankrupt this country.
I agree with those who have said that this erratic, haphazard trade war is hurting American families. As Senator Klobuchar said, 300,000 American jobs. It's estimated that it's cost $600 to the average American family. Just a couple of days ago, 60% of Americans said that they believe that we're in for a recession next year. So when I become president, I would immediately begin to negotiate with China to ratchet down that trade war.
Donald Trump in office on trade policy, you know, he reminds me of that guy in The Wizard of Oz, you know, when you pull back the curtain, it's a really small dude.
Trump obviously hasn't a clue. Trump thinks that trade policy is a tweet at 3 o'clock in the morning. What we have got to do is develop a trade policy that represents workers, represents the farmers in the Midwest and elsewhere who are losing billions right now because of Trump's policy.
Donald Trump's America First policy is actually an America isolated, an America alone policy.
Exactly right.
From trade to battling China to the global crisis of climate change, the challenges in the Middle East, he is pulling us away from our allies, out of the Iran deal, out of the Paris Climate Accords. And on trade, he's deciding to take on China while at the same time taking on tariff battles with all of our allies. You literally have him using a national security waiver to put tariffs on Canada. Now look, I'm the only person on the stage that finds Trudeau's hair very menacing, but they are not a national security threat. We cannot go up against China alone. This is a president that has a better relationship with dictators like Duterte and Putin than he does with Merkel and Macron. We are the strongest nation on the planet Earth, and our strength is multiplied and magnified when we stand with our allies in common cause and common purpose. That's how we beat China. That's how we beat climate change on the planet Earth, and that's how American values are the ones that lead on issues of trade and workers' rights.
Let's turn to the economy. You just heard my interview with the president's trade advisor, Peter Navarro. President Trump says taking his tariffs off China now would be, quote, economic surrender, saying the U.S. cannot make a trade deal without dialing up more pressure. You have vowed to lift those tariffs if you become president. What makes you think China would make a trade deal with you as president without the kind of pressure that President Trump is now exerting with these tariffs?
Well, we have a lot of different forms of leverage in the relationship, but it's also a fool's errand to think you're going to be able to get China to change the fundamentals of their economic model by poking them in the eye with some tariffs.
And this issue, which could spell economic disaster for America eventually, meaning a recession, is all Donald Trump's fault. No one else has any responsibility for the creation of the potential disaster that could be coming our way, thanks entirely to the Trump tariffs and the Trump trade war, which has so far been ignored by most of the candidates and questioners in the Democratic presidential debates. Donald Trump is the only president in history who has told the American people that war is easy. He wasn't talking about a shooting war, of course. He was talking about a trade war. But trade wars are called wars for a reason. They are not called trade games. And no American president prior to Donald Trump has said trade wars are good and easy to win. Trade wars have casualties. People lose jobs and lose income in every country involved in a trade war. And Donald Trump should know that by now. But this week he dropped more bombs in his trade war by increasing the tariffs that Americans must now pay for Chinese goods to the point where JP Morgan now estimates that the tariffs will cost the average American household $1,000 a year. For most people, coming up with an extra $1,000 a year to pay in taxes, which is what tariffs actually are, is not easy. And the Democratic nominee for president will surely be running hard against the Trump tariffs, but so far the Democratic candidates are staying relatively quiet about the Trump tariffs and giving Donald Trump a very long leash in which he appears to be getting himself all tangled up politically. Are you at all surprised with what the Trump tariffs have delivered?
No, of course not. Look, we had the conversation back 2 years ago when President Trump first started saying he was going to launch this trade war. And I told you, these tariffs, if he does them, they're going to put the in dumb. There's nothing. This is the biggest tax increase on the middle class, I believe, ever in U.S. history. We're going to charge middle class Americans $1,000 each to entertain this fantasy that we're achieving something. We're not. You don't get the Chinese to change their behavior by publicly humiliating them and trying to bully them. That doesn't work. We got them, for example, to stop devaluing their currency. And the way we did that is we got all our allies on the same page, and then we went with specific strategic demands. We said, look, you need to change your currency devaluation behavior in this way, and if you don't, we will react in the following way. And that got them to change their behavior. Donald Trump has not made any specific demands. He thinks that this is working. He thinks this is actually good. And as you pointed out, manufacturing starting to contract. The University of Michigan consumer confidence numbers came out. I believe it was the biggest drop in consumer confidence in 6 years. And there are strong points in the economy, there's no question. But if we keep escalating this trade war, as this week we had a major escalation, we're going to get a recession. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
The trade war is on. Today, China retaliated against the U.S. by announcing plans to slap tariffs on $60 billion of U.S. goods. This is rocking the markets. Right now, the Dow is down nearly 700 points. And despite the market's negative reaction, President Trump continued to insist in a series of tweets that tariffs are actually helping the economy. But it's not.
But the thing about Trump and China that I find so disturbing, too, is, there's that old Chinese saying that when you ask a Westerner what time it is, they look at their watch. And when you ask a Chinese person what time it is, they look at the calendar. Trump is playing for 2020. He's playing for every day for what the stock market goes up or down. The Chinese are playing for 2200. They're playing for 100 years from now. Who are you going to put your money on? People who don't have to react to the stock market every day, or people who are playing a long game, which is what the Chinese are playing? They just feel like they're going to outbox him in the long run, and they're going to outbox him in the short run, too.
On the trade war between China and the United States, what is interesting is that China hasn't folded yet under this sort of shock and awe of tariffs from President Trump. And I think it's worth thinking about, why is that the case? Is China just being stubborn, or is there some aspect of the Chinese position that is perhaps not so well understood in the West? And I don't think that position is very well understood in Washington, and I don't think it's very well understood globally. So it is interesting that China hasn't folded yet, and it may well be that President Trump has gone one step too far and needs to roll back. And of course, the other thing that the Chinese are incredibly aware of is that in China there is no political cycle. President Trump has got 15 months to sort this out before he faces re-election. So time is very much on China's side. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, but I think it's going to play out very differently to the way that many in Washington expect.
Trump has got the worst witch's brew of economic policy ever presented since I've been following this since 1970. We've got a trade war on consumers that's not going to help. This policy will bring down the economy, which is already on its last leg. A recession is going to happen 5 months or 10 months or 20 months down the road.